Hello and welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the programme. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the latest of our online lectures. This evening, Paul Burston speaking on Is the Gay Novel Dead? I'll be here in half an hour's time after the recorded lecture for question and answers and comments from you. If you'd like to post some questions on comments, then please do so in the chat box on your YouTube page, and also you can do so on Twitter. Our handle is @InsightsNCL, and you can add the hashtag InsightsNCL for your comments. Now to introduce our speaker, my colleague, Dr. Gareth Longstaff, from the Lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Gareth Longstaff and I'm a lecturer and researcher here at Newcastle University. My work focuses mainly on queer theory, media and history, with an emphasis specifically on desire and really the study and the understanding around gay masculinity and gay male desire. I'm also the co-founder and lead for the staff LGBT Rainbow Network here at Newcastle, which strives to embed change and celebrates our queer pasts, presents and futures. And I think that's why, particularly at this time in human history, really, during such a challenging and uncertain and unprecedented period that we've come to know as the COVID-19 pandemic, that's why LGBT History Month, which this lecture marks and celebrates, is more important than ever, particularly in terms of how queer and LGBT visibility, well-being and voice are articulated and mapped. On that particular theme, I'm delighted and privileged to introduce Paul Burston as our speaker for this year, 2021. Paul is the author of 6 novels and the editor of 2 short story collections. He's also the co-editor of a fantastic edited collection called A Queer Romance, Lesbians, Gay Men and Popular Culture, which has become a classic of queer studies. And I'm just citing that because that for me is a brilliant example of an academic and a non-academic collection of insights and ideas, which has been with me for at least 25 years, and along with the name of Paul Burston, something which I think really makes its mark in the sort of the recent history of LGBT people in this country. Nonetheless, and alongside of that, that's really 25 years old as the starting point. Paul's more recent work, particularly The Black Path from 2016, was a first crime novel and a #1 bestseller, and his debut novel Shameless from 2001 was shortlisted for the State of Britain Award. Paul is a curator and a host of the award-winning LGBTQ+ literary salon Polari at the South Bank Centre in London, and also founder of the Polari First Book Prize for debut writers and the Polari Prize for established writers. So much going on and so many kind of skills and multi-layered approaches to LGBT life, and huge respect to Paul for that. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Sunday Times and other publications, and he's also written and presented documentaries for Channel 4, and often contributes and can be seen on television and heard on radio. And for me as well, his work across journalism and particularly his work for publications like Time Out and Gay Times are also intrinsic in the recent history and experiences of gay and queer people in the UK. The Closer I Get is also very much worth a mention as one of the best novels that I've read in the last few years, and one which really stands out, I think, in the work, the vast body of work that Paul has produced. We're incredibly fortunate to have him this year to give this LGBT annual History Month lecture as part of the Insights. And Paul, in a typically insightful and contemporary and provocative fashion, has posed the question, is the gay novel dead, as part of his lecture today. I'll just give you a very brief overview, and then I will hand over to Paul and the lecture for you to enjoy. Paul suggests that the novelist Alan Hollinghurst has declared that the gay novel has had its day, but and again in Paul's words, nothing could be more further from the truth. The political context may have changed, but the need to tell our stories is as strong as ever. I leave you with that thought and hand over to Paul. I hope you enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
I grew up in a house without any books. It was a house where gay people were rarely mentioned, except as figures of fun on TV or subjects of scandal in the daily tabloids. For a long time, These were the only images of gay men available to me. There were no gay characters on soap operas when I was growing up. No Queer as Folk, no Tales of the City, no Netflix. There was nobody I could identify with, nobody to tell me it was going to be okay. I knew I was different from an early age. The other boys knew too, and tried to beat it out of me. They failed. I didn't dare tell my parents I was being bullied. I was afraid they'd ask me why. I was afraid they might reject me. So I kept it to myself. I learned how to lie convincingly. I play acted. I felt isolated and alienated. I say this not to evoke sympathy, but because those early years shaped me as a person and as a writer. From an early age, I felt like an outsider looking in, observing people. What better start in life for a novelist? All writers start out as readers, and I was always a keen reader. My mother encouraged me to read because she wanted me to do well at school. The thought of reading for pleasure was anathema to her. It still is. I joined the local library and I read everything I could find. I was the kid who read books under the blanket late at night with the torch. For me, reading was an escape. It still is. I was 10 years old when the Jeremy Thorpe scandal first made headlines. It was 1975, the same year The Naked Civil Servant was shown on television for the first time. My mother was working as a night nurse at the local hospital. I watched the drama with my stepdad. At the end, he turned to me and he said, "Your mother's worried you'll turn out like that." I don't blame my parents. They were products of their time. And when the time came for me to finally tell them I was gay, they took it pretty well. But that was many years later. For a long time, they didn't really know me at all. By the age of 11, I was pretty sure I was gay. I scoured the bookshelves at the library looking for people like me. There were no YA books aimed at younger gay readers back then, no LGBT section to help steer the way. I had no idea there were even such things as gay writers or gay novels. I found my fictional friends wherever I could. I read Carrie by Stephen King and identified strongly with the central character. Spot the resemblance? Unlike Carrie, I wasn't a teenage girl and I didn't have the power of telekinesis. But like her, I was bullied at school and felt like an outsider at home. I was a stranger to myself and to those around me. I think many LGBTQ+ children know this feeling all too well. Then at 14, I discovered the patron saint of alienated outsiders, David Bowie. Bowie didn't just say that being gay was okay. He made it look like something to aspire to. He made it seem cool. He offered me a lifeline. As he sang on Rock and Roll Suicide, "Oh no, love, you're not alone." For a closeted, isolated gay teenager, that was a powerful statement. It struck a chord. It opened up a world of possibilities. This is me, age 17, having discovered Ziggy Stardust and red hair dye. My introduction to gay novels came from pop music. I listened to Bowie and discovered the works of Jean Genet. I listened to Soft Cell and discovered the books of John Rechy. At 18, I left home and went to university where I studied English and drama and came out. I made gay friends and I read all the gay novels I could find: James Baldwin, Christopher Isherwood, Armistead Maupin, Edmund White. I graduated with ambitions of becoming a theatre director. I wrote a couple of plays and directed a few fringe shows before going back to college to do an MA. I wrote my thesis on homosexuality in Hollywood film. I wrote some film reviews. I even had one published. Then my life changed direction. In the late 80s, AIDS impacted on my life in a major way. Friends got ill, and I joined the AIDS activist group ACT UP London. ACT UP began in New York and was committed to non-violent direct action to highlight the plight of those living with HIV and AIDS. For 2 years, I devoted myself entirely to ACT UP. I spent a lot of time in meetings, a lot of time on demos, a lot of time in police cells, and a lot of time in court. I also went to a lot of funerals. AIDS gave me a focus and a sense of urgency. Seeing people die before their time can do that to you. The men I knew died in their early 30s, before they'd realised their full potential. It broke my heart, and it motivated me. It gave me a sense of purpose. Activism led to journalism, first for the gay press, then for a magazine called City Limits, and then for the London Listings Bible, Time Out. For 20 years, I edited what became known as the LGBT section of Time Out. During that time, I also wrote for newspapers and magazines. I wrote and presented a few documentaries for Channel 4, and I wrote books. My first book was published in 1995, and my first novel in 2001. It was called Shameless. It did well, and even earned a glowing review in the New York Times. My second novel, Star People, followed in 2005 and sank without trace. In 2007, I published my third novel, Lovers and Losers. It told the story of a fictional 80s pop duo. It was also my AIDS novel. It was well received, and I was shortlisted for a Stonewall Award, but I had very few opportunities to promote the book. By this point in my career, I'd published 8 books in total. I'd never once been invited to take part in any kind of book festival. The book was published in May, so I'd missed LGBT History Month. So I had the idea of a literary event to promote LGBTQ+ writers, and in November 2007, Polari was born. Polari is a live showcase for established and emerging LGBTQ+ literary talent. It started small, in the upstairs room of a bar in Soho. It grew very quickly.
Living with her mum Iris in Great Yarmouth, that beautiful seaside spot. Has anyone been there? Yeah. I'm really sorry. And you again, the actress pulled a dust sheet from a large armature and wrapped herself in it. God bless my eyesight.
I wish I could lower the tone. But I don't think that's possible.
Since 2009, we've been based at the South Bank Centre. Events are held monthly and feature a wide variety of writers. For me, diversity is the key to Polari's success. A typical event will feature 4 or 5 writers from a wide range of cultural backgrounds, writing across many different genres. We feature poets, novelists, short story writers, non-fiction writers, even cartoonists. Polari is about visibility, and it's about sharing our stories. Stories are important. The stories we tell about ourselves and each other help shape who we are as individuals and as a community. We also tour regularly, funded by the Arts Council. Over the past 7 years, we've travelled the length and breadth of the country, from Huddersfield to Worthing, from Manchester to Edinburgh, from Newcastle to Bradford and Nottingham. We've been to Belfast, Dublin and sunny Mallorca. We've been to Hastings, and we've even been to heaven. A year ago, we embarked on our biggest, most ambitious tour yet. Though things being what they are, most of our events have taken place online. In 2011, we launched the Polari First Book Prize for emerging LGBTQ+ literary talent. Writers must be born or based in the UK and Ireland. The prize has grown year on year and produced some very worthy winners. So when Alan Hollinghurst declared that the gay novel has had its day, I was surprised to say the least. Hollinghurst was speaking at the Hay Festival. His argument was that we live in more liberated times now, which offer less inspiration for gay storytellers than the decades spent battling AIDS and fighting for equality. I'm not sure this is true. I think there are still battles to be won. We may have legal equality, but homophobia hasn't gone away. In many parts of the UK, it still isn't safe to walk the streets holding your same-sex partner's hand. I also wonder which books he's been reading lately. Has he read Fairy Tales for Lost Children by Dirye Osman? Osman won the Polari First Book Prize in 2014 with his lyrical book about the experiences of LGBTQ+ asylum seekers in the UK. Has he read The Good Son by Paul McVeigh, which won the prize in 2016? The story is told in the voice of a gay 11-year-old boy growing up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. How about Guapa by Salim Haddad, who won the prize in 2017? Guapa explores the lives of gay Muslims during the Arab Spring. These are all what you'd call gay novels, and each one is timely, compelling, and thought-provoking in its own way. In 2019, the prize was won by Angela Chadwick for her debut novel, XX. We also added a second prize for established writers, which was won by the poet Andrew Macmillan for his second poetry collection, Playtime. Here they are with our sponsors and one of our judges that year, Bernardine Evaristo. In 2020, the prizes were won by Amru Al-Qadi and Kate Davis. I still consider myself an activist. Running a book prize to celebrate queer writing is a form of activism. The reason we added a second prize is that the publishing industry tends to focus most of its energy on debuts. This is more so the case now than when I first started out. There isn't the same commitment to developing a writer's career over the course of 3, 4, 5 or more novels. My fourth novel was a comedy of manners about gay marriage. I made the cover of Boys magazine and was dropped by my publisher. I edited 2 short story collections and contributed to an anthology called Bloody Vampires. My next novel marked a change in direction. For years I wrote novels populated by openly gay characters, living lives many of us would recognise. And to be honest, I felt I had nothing left to say on the subject. But I did have a story I wanted to tell. The town where I grew up is a big army recruitment town. The local cemetery is full of soldiers' graves dating back to World War I. And there's a place called the Black Path, which many regard as a local beauty spot, but where bad things tend to happen. The Black Path is a thriller about a young woman called Helen who is married to a soldier serving in Afghanistan. But somehow, those gay characters wouldn't leave me alone. There's a subplot involving Helen's husband Owen and a rumoured relationship with a young gay soldier. In 2019, I published my 6th novel, The Closer I Get. Like most of my books, it features a gay protagonist. It's also the most personal novel I've written. Some years ago, I became the target of a homophobic harassment campaign by a very persistent online stalker. I didn't know who they were. For a long time, I didn't even know if they were male or female. There were no photos of them online, no means of identifying them. All I knew is that they were obsessive, relentless, and determined to cause me as much stress as possible. It began on Twitter. At the height of this person's campaign, I was receiving dozens of abusive tweets every single day. Then it spilled over into other areas of my life: emails, blogs, posts on websites and message boards, phone calls to my employers, threats to come to my author events and sort me out. For months, I had personal security. By now, I knew the name of the person stalking me, but I still didn't know what they looked like. They could have been virtually anyone in the audience. They could have been harmless, or they could have been planning to rush at me with a knife. I was drinking heavily. I ended up on antidepressants. It was then that I finally went to the police. Naively, I assumed that as soon as I reported the crime, the police would take over and gather all the evidence they needed. But that's not what happened. They don't have the resources. I had to do it myself. I spent months putting together sufficient evidence of the stalking to persuade the CPS to prosecute. Finally, the case came to court, and I saw my stalker in the flesh. A woman in her 40s who was clearly suffering from mental health issues. Had she not been so unkind to me, I might have felt sorry for her. She was found guilty of harassment without violence. Unlike racially or faith-motivated offences, there is no aggravated offence legislation in UK law for crimes motivated by homophobia. But in her summing up, the judge stressed the homophobic nature of the case. The defendant was given a 2-year suspended sentence and issued with a restraining order, and that was the end of that. I never heard from her again. It was only later that I discovered that over 40% of people convicted of harassment breached their restraining order, which got me thinking, what would I have done had it continued? I now knew who the stalker was and where they lived. Had the harassment continued, would I have been tempted to take the law into my own hands? I'd like to think not, but I can't be certain. Instead, I wrote a novel inspired by my experiences. Many crime novels end with the perpetrator being apprehended. This one opens with them standing trial. I was far more interested in what happens afterwards. As I know from personal experience, the story doesn't end in court. There's the emotional impact of the crime and how it affects both the victim and the perpetrator. The story is told largely from the point of view of the stalker. This was a conscious decision. I wanted to get inside the head of somebody who'd behave in such a way. I wanted to understand them. I wanted closure, and writing the novel provided it. This is how the story begins. So this is chapter 1, day 1. It was great seeing you today. You probably don't believe me, not after everything that's happened, but it's the truth. I'd never lie to you, Tom. I never have, not once. I'm not like the others. Sometimes I think I'm the only truly honest person left. We live in an age of such deceit, don't we? People lie all the time. It's second nature to them. Everyone is so afraid of appearing stupid or saying the wrong thing and offending someone. Everyone's so keen to make a good impression. Virtue signalling, boasting about their perfect lives on Facebook. Posting artfully posed selfies, filtered photographs of their dinner on Instagram. Social media has made liars of us all. Not me, though. If anything, I'm too honest for my own good. Maybe if I'd learned to hold my tongue more, we wouldn't be in this mess. But then I wouldn't be true to myself. I can't change the way I am, Tom, even for you, even if there's a price to pay. You used to admire my honesty. Refreshing, you said. A free thinker, you said. Did you change your mind? Were you humouring me when you said those things? I'd hate to think that you lied to me from the outset. That would make you a hypocrite, my darling. I probably shouldn't tell you this. I probably shouldn't be writing to you at all. But before we go any further and our words are twisted and taken out of context, I want to make one thing clear. I don't blame you. Honestly. I don't think you knew what you were getting yourself into. I don't think either of us did. Maybe if we had, we'd have done things differently. But life's not like that. You don't wake up one morning knowing that today is the day you'll meet the person who'll change your life forever. You don't go into these things with your eyes wide open. They just sort of creep up on you. And that's how it was with us. We don't decide when we fall in love. We don't choose it. It chooses us. We have no more control over it than we have control over the weather. Do you recognise those words, Tom? You should, because you wrote them. That's a direct quote from your second novel. I wonder if you knew then how true those words were, or were you just trying them on for size the way some writers do? I suppose it's what critics would call literary style. I'm not a big fan of style myself. I prefer my writers to say what they mean and mean what they say, but as I think we've established, I'm not your average reader. I remember the night we first met. I don't wear makeup as a rule, but I made a special effort that night. Eyeliner, lipstick, a bit of blush. It's not every day a girl gets to meet the man she's admired from afar. I remember the crisp white shirt you wore, the slightly cocky, slightly nervous smile when you walked into the crowded bookshop. I remember thinking, your author's photograph didn't do you justice, that you were far better looking in the flesh. Never did I imagine this would be the start of something life-changing. I'd only come to hear you speak and get my book signed. Emotional attachments were the last thing on my mind. Contrary to what you may be thinking, I didn't plan for any of what happened afterwards. Grand passions really aren't my thing. I'm not one of those women who sits around dreaming of being swept off their feet. I've never needed a man to complete me, not like my mother. She was never happy unless she had a room full of male admirers, yet never tired of boasting of her feminist credentials. But then we both know what hypocrites feminists can be, don't we? In fact, that was one of the first things that we agreed on that night at the bookshop when I stayed behind after the crowds had dwindled. Some dreary woman was complaining about the lack of positive female role models in your books, as if your first responsibility as a novelist isn't to tell a good story, but to make her feel validated. I could see you needed rescuing, so I spoke up. That's the trouble with some feminists. What they lack in imagination, they make up for in self-righteousness. You feigned shock. And what kind of feminist are you? The recovering kind, I replied, and you laughed, flashing those perfect white teeth of yours. You asked my name and I handed you my business card. Evie, you said. That's a pretty name. I watched you slide the card into your breast pocket. Then you took my book and you signed it. To Evie, a kindred spirit. Best wishes, Tom Hunter. Imagine, me and Tom Hunter, kindred spirits. If only you'd known how thrilled I was. But I hid it well. I've always been good at hiding things. That was just the beginning. I'd been following you on Twitter for a year by then, but despite tagging you in several posts that praised your work, you hadn't followed me back. Clearly you had a change of heart that night. Did you check my profile before you went to sleep? Did you lie awake counting down the hours until you made your next move? Because at 6:12 a.m. the next morning, there it was, a notification informing me that you were now following me back on Twitter. I tried not to read too much into it, but I couldn't help myself. 6:12 a.m. is a very intimate time to be expressing an interest in somebody. Most of us are barely awake at such an early hour. I pictured you lying in bed, wiping the sleep from your eyes, looking at your phone, thinking of me. It's no wonder my mind was racing. A girl could be forgiven for thinking you had designs on her, and as this girl soon discovered, she wasn't wrong. But back to today. I spotted you long before you saw me. You were climbing out of a black cab. You had the collar of your jacket turned up and a red scarf tied loosely around your neck. You looked good. A little tied around the eyes perhaps, but that's only to be expected. It can't have been easy for you keeping up appearances all this time. No wonder the strain is showing. I assume that was her with you, Emma Norton, the one I'm obliged to refer to as the other woman. I must say, she looks nothing like her profile picture. She's obviously not a natural blonde, is she? Not like me. Dad says my hair is the colour of honey. The sweetness starts at the top of my head and runs through me like letters through a stick of rock. Was Emma the reason you blanked me today? I won't pretend I wasn't hurt by that. My lawyer said I shouldn't talk to you, but we're both adults, we can still be civil to one another. Just because someone studied law doesn't mean they're always right, does it? I've had injury lawyers cold calling me about car accidents that never even happened. That's how much faith I have in the legal profession. Remember when Morrissey wrote that song describing lawyers as liars? As a fellow fan, I'm sure you'll agree, he had a point. Listening to all the legal arguments today, I was struck by a number of things. One, what a mess we've made for ourselves. Two, what clever bastards those lawyers are. They twist everything, don't they? And three, wouldn't it be easier if we just sorted this out between ourselves? I know we tried once before. That night I waited for you outside your flat. Maybe if you'd asked me and instead of freaking out and calling the police, we could have resolved our differences there and then. We still could, you know. It's not too late. Why make this any harder than it needs to be? I'm willing to forgive and forget if you are. Promise me you'll think about it. Sleep on it and email me in the morning. And if I don't hear from you, at least I'll know where I stand. And I'll see you tomorrow in court. Yours, Evie. Thank you. The Closer I Get is a crime novel, but it's also a gay novel. Crime fiction has long been a platform for LGBTQ+ writers and stories, from Patricia Highsmith's Ripley novels to the work of Val McDermott or Mari Hanna. My protagonist is gay, and the book explores the impact of homophobia. It's also a novel that couldn't have been written 20 years ago. The real-life case was one of the first of the so-called Twitter trials. This year marks 20 years since my first novel was published. During that time, I've seen a lot of changes happen in the industry. It can still be an uphill struggle getting books by and about LGBTQ+ people published, but the demand for them is stronger than ever, and growing numbers of publishers are rising to the challenge. The number of submissions to the Polari Prize has grown year on year. Last year, we received a record number of books from a wide variety of writers. And with novels like these eligible for this year's prize, this trend looks set to continue. Far from having had its day, I believe the gay novel is alive and well. The political context may have changed, at least here in the UK, but the need to tell our stories is as strong now as it ever was.
And here we are live with our speaker. Paul Burston, thank you very much for your lecture this evening at Insights.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's quite a shock seeing footage and images of people in public together. And when you speak of, and you talk of the AIDS crisis, and we speak in the middle of another very different medical crisis, I wonder what parallels you notice between the two periods and the two crises.
I think there are some parallels. I think there is a sense, whether it's true or not, but I think there's a sense that the government isn't really taking responsibility properly, and people feel that they're being let down by their leaders, which is certainly true of the AIDS crisis. I think there is also a sense sometimes that certain people are expendable. I think that the way that people talk about, oh, the only people that die are those who are elderly or have underlying health conditions, as if that somehow makes their lives less valuable. So those are the parallels. I think the big difference is that the AIDS crisis was very shaped by stigma, and the fact that as people were dying, the newspapers were actually crowing about it. You know, the tabloids, even The Guardian on occasion, but the tabloids in particular were virulent. I mean, there were headlines about how gay men should be all rounded up and put into quarantine or put on an island somewhere, or they should be gassed. I mean, there were some really horrific headlines. And to live through that traumatic time, which is being very well documented in Russell T. Davis's program, It's a Sin at the moment, which really captures that spirit of that time very well. To live through all of that, and then to have the media basically telling you that your lives aren't worth anything and that you deserve this. There was an idea that you deserve it. People used to make the distinction between innocent and guilty victims. So haemophiliacs were innocent victims, but gay men were guilty victims. Why? So there was, I think, the stigma, which hasn't gone away. There's still stigma around HIV, even to this day, and even within our own community. So I think the main difference is the stigma.
Were there any issues with the screening of It's a Sin at the time of the pandemic? I mean, presumably it had been made before 2020. Yes,
it had. I've known Russell T. Davis for many years, and I was one of the people that he consulted when he was working on the screenplay. And there are a couple of scenes in there. If people have seen it, there's a bonfire scene. That was my friend's family. There were a couple of scenes that I told him about. And I know for a fact that he was very concerned because obviously it's been in development for quite a while, I think 5-6 years. No one could have predicted that once it finally got its viewing slot organised, that we'd be in the middle of this pandemic. And I think he was concerned that people would be put off, that people would have had enough of pandemics to be watching a drama about another pandemic many years ago. I think, judging by the fact that it's been the most watched program on 4D on their digital channel, just proves that those fears were unfounded, which is great. And I think it's wonderful. I mean, I know a lot of people of my generation who haven't watched it because they feel they lived it and they don't want to go there, and they find it too traumatic. I did find it traumatic. I did find it very triggering. I cried a lot watching it, but I also found it very cathartic. And I think that, we can't change what happened. It happened, and we lived through it. And many of us have a lot of accumulated trauma as a result of it, because you didn't have the chance to grieve properly for people because there were so many funerals all at once. I remember being at one funeral for somebody and grieving and realizing I was crying for somebody else who we'd buried a month before and feeling really guilty. And that's not normal. That's not a normal way of going through life, at 25. It's a bit like living through a war, I suppose. So I think to watch that program now is a very cathartic thing, because there's enough distance on it now. I can revisit it from a position of safety and emotional safety, and watch that and feel it again, but also think, well, we got through it. Many of us got through it. Many of us didn't, of course, and that's terribly sad, and that will never ever go away. That'll always be part of my emotional makeup. But I think to shy away from it, for me, wouldn't have been the right thing to do. I think it was important for me to watch it.
The questions are coming in, and you can ask your questions and make your comments at the chat box on YouTube or on Twitter at InsightsNCL. Sarah asks the question we always want to ask every writer we meet. When did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Gosh, from a very young age, when I was at junior school, I had this friend called Caroline, who I'm still friends with, and she was an aspiring artist, and I was an aspiring story writer. And I used to write these books called The Adventures of Jim, and they were truly terrible. They were so derivative. It was whatever I'd watched on television that week. So there was usually bits of Bonanza, bits of Doctor Who, Jim met many Daleks. And I would write the stories on one side of the page, and she would do the illustrations on the opposite page. And we'd get summoned and asked to I'd read them out in morning assembly at school, and then obviously get bullied for showing off. So that was the start of it. And I wrote in my teens an awful lot. I never had any idea that I would end up doing or being a writer professionally. That was never an option as far as I was aware. My background was very working class, and it wasn't, nobody encouraged you to be creative. I remember when I went to university and my mum said to me, well, you can still be a teacher. There was no sense that you could actually do English and drama for any reason other than to teach English and drama. So I always wrote things, and I wrote several novels which I abandoned in my teens and in my 20s, early 20s. And then, of course, AIDS came along and everything went off in that direction for about 4 or 5 years. And it was only really once I established myself as a journalist that I sort of went back to those ambitions of wanting to be a writer again, because the journalism kind of gave me the sense that I could actually get paid for writing words. I'd never thought that would be a possibility in my life. That was never something I envisaged happening. And the media then, even less so than now, but even then, was very, very, very middle class. And I found it quite difficult to sort of work my way in there. I knew a handful of editors at various newspapers who had similar backgrounds to mine. And same with publishing, the publishing world. And now, for various reasons, it's become less so. There are even fewer working class people from those backgrounds working in those positions, which does end up shaping which stories get commissioned and which stories get told, because people tend to commission stories that reflect the lives that they recognize. I remember having a conversation about The Black Path, my novel The Black Path, a few years ago, where someone said, I don't recognize these women. And I thought, well, you haven't gone out on a Friday night then, because if you do, you'd recognize these women. These are women in every town in the whole of the country on a Friday night. They're women like the women in that book. But she lived a very, very rarefied existence that didn't involve people like that. So I think class is still a really big issue in publishing and in writing. And it certainly sort of made me hesitant at the beginning, but because I had this sort of very politicized ambition to be a writer, it wasn't because I wanted to be a writer, it's because I wanted to say something that I felt needed to be said. So I came at it from a very, very agitprop activist point of view. And I refused to take no for an answer. I just kept banging on the doors until they let me in.
And yes, it's got more narrow now. Do you have any idea why it goes against one's expectations that it should be harder than it had been?
Well, I think for a long time, publishing, obviously most publishing is based in and around London. London is a horribly expensive place to live. If you're a young person moving to London now, compared to when I moved there 35 years ago, your chances of managing to find accommodation and a job that's going to cover that and your cost of living is quite slim. So the people that tend to work in publishing, especially at the entry level, are on often very low salaries. So it tends to be people that have got wealthy parents who can basically support them living in London. So they're the people that are entering the system. It's much harder for somebody who doesn't have the cushion of having family who can afford to pay their rent or cover their bills to work in London. So I think it's mainly to do with the fact that London has just become such a hostile environment for people from lower incomes and lower income backgrounds.
Mm. This question from Mark follows on quite nicely from that, when he asks, do you think your childhood may have been easier if you'd had the opportunity to absorb yourself in gay writing at an earlier age?
Oh my God, and without question. I honestly felt like I was the only person like this in the world. I didn't know, the only images I had were these caricatures on television, many of which I now really appreciate and enjoy. I actually find Larry Grayson and Dick Emery and people like that hilariously funny now. But when I was a young child, and that was the only image I ever saw, and the only comments I ever heard, either from my parents who didn't know and didn't mean it, they weren't aware. But it was just the way that people spoke then. That you make comments about puffs all the time. So I didn't know any real life gay people. I remember being in an English class in the sixth form. We were studying D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers, and the teacher was called Mr. Archard, and he was a huge influence on me. And during the discussion about Sons and Lovers, a girl in the class raised her hand and said she thought that Paul Morell was a bit of a puff. And Mr. Archard hit the roof and just said, it was the first time I'd ever heard anyone get angry on behalf of gay people, and just said, you should not speak about gay people like this. I have many gay friends and they should be treated with respect. By the end of his outburst, she was sitting there bright red in the face, and so was I, because I felt seen. And I'd never ever heard anyone talk about gay people in anything other than a hostile way before. And that was when I was 17 years of age. So for 17 years, I had no positive influences whatsoever. Had I known, or had there been books that had been aimed at people like me, then I think it would have made a huge difference to my experience of my teenage years, because as it was, I felt very, very isolated, very alienated. I had a brief period where I felt suicidal. Thankfully, I sort of got through that, but it was a very troubled time for me. And I think it still is for many, many young LGBTQ people, but I think at least now there are ways of connecting, whether it's through books, whether it's through television, whether it's through social media. Whereas back then there were so few ways of connecting. It was very easy to be isolated and alone. And that's a really frightening place to be when you think that you're different.
Gerrit asks, it has been noted that so many young LGBTQ people don't have a sense of our shared history. Other than the writers and musicians that you've mentioned, are there others you would personally recommend?
Oh gosh, there are so many. I think there are many great books about the history of the gay movement. There's a wonderful book called "And the Band Played On" by Randy Shilts, which is about the growth of the AIDS epidemic in America. There's a book by Simon Garfield. I can't remember the title, it slipped my mind, something to do with love. There's the sort of British equivalent of that book. And there are lots of books of history. I'm not sure if many of them are still in print. A lot of the books that I discovered when I came out were published by small independent presses, either academic ones, or there was a press called Gay Men's Press that published, like as it sounds, books for gay men. So there were basically lots of coming out novels, lots of novels about gay characters, and they're no longer around. Somewhere like Gay's the Word, which is one of the few sort of independent LGBTQ+ bookshops we have left now in the UK, and probably the most well-known one. They do a really good trade in second-hand books. So there were lots of books that I read back then. There's a wonderful book I read called Queens by Pickles, which was a kind of answer to Larry Kramer's novel Faggots, which caused an uproar in America because he was satirizing the world that he was living in. This is before AIDS. He wrote this book called Faggots, which was all about the kind of excesses of the gay lifestyle. And he was parodying and satirizing the way that these men were living. He was criticized hugely by many in the gay community for presenting a very bad picture of us in front of other people and all the rest of it. And then this character called Pickles, which obviously wasn't his real name, wrote a book called Queens, which came out in the UK a couple of years later, which I read in the mid-80s. And it was really describing the life I was living. I mean, it was just completely the life that I knew. It was about a bunch of young gay people in London going to heaven and going to various bars and clubs. And there were these various types, archetypes, stroke stereotypes in it. And it was satirizing that world. And I read that book and loved it and enjoyed it and found it very, very, very funny. Some people got very offended by it. It fell out of print, although I did manage to get a secondhand copy a couple of years ago from Gay's the Word, because my copy had fallen apart because I read it so many times. It had all fallen apart, the pages were falling out. So I think Gay's the Word is the best reference place, really. I mean, they've got such a huge encyclopedic knowledge of our historical books, and also they have many of them available, whether they're original copies or whether they're new imprints.
Is it because of online retailing, online association that's left that has been the only bookshops in the country? Has it been a loss of these community activities?
I think online has been a huge boon in lots of ways. I think it's been very detrimental to a lot of independent businesses. I think, especially Amazon, because Amazon has undercut everybody. So it's very difficult for an independent bookshop to compete with Amazon when Amazon is selling books so much cheaper than it should be being sold for. And then there's an expectation now, which is that people expect a novel to cost £4 and then a digital version to cost £1.99. Well, how are you going to pay the author? How is the author going to pay back their advance based on that? If you compare that to what happens in Canada or America, people will expect to spend $20 on a novel, on a hardback novel, and they won't flinch about that. That's just expected. Here we have this very strange expectation, which is largely to do with online and the way that Amazon has infiltrated the market. So it makes it difficult for independent booksellers to compete. I'm pleased that Gay's the Word, there were several occasions where it looked like Gay's the Word was going to go out of business, and it was bailed out. It did lots of fundraising activities. There were some very generous donations from various, donors who wish to remain anonymous. And over the last few years, they've really got their online selling together. So they do a really, really good online service now. So they're sending books out to all parts of the country. And you don't get that from Amazon. On Amazon, you can find books, but you can't really get recommendations. You can't really have knowledge about that book unless you just rely on reader reviews. And as I'm sure many people appreciate, many reader reviews, so, I mean, I've read reader reviews that say something like, 1 star, the book arrived damaged, as if that's the author's fault. And then suddenly the author's rating goes right the way down because the book arrived and it was dented by the postman or by the Amazon delivery person. So I think, having people that actually know about the product, know about the books that they're selling is a much more valuable commodity than we don't treasure that enough, I don't think. I think it's more valuable than we realize.
Speaking of interaction, we have a question from David who asks, have you had any surprising responses to your novels?
Surprising, yes. I mean, I've had, especially earlier on in my career, when Shameless came out, it was a bit like I was describing with Pickles. I mean, because it sort of held a mirror up to the gay world that I was living at that time, which is the sort of late 90s, going into the noughties, which was very, very hedonistic, and it was the kind of post-AIDS moment because the new medications had come along. People weren't dying as much anymore. People were out going and celebrating, and there was lots of ecstasy and other drugs and party drugs involved. And I wrote about that, and some people took great umbrage at that they thought that it wasn't appropriate to sort of shine a light on this. I mean, the book, I think, is a very sweet love story, but because it's set against this backdrop of this kind of excessive hedonism, and the main character goes looking for love in all the wrong places and sort of learns a lesson along the way. Some people took great exception to it, and I was accused of being self-loathing, of hating other gay people. I mean, crazy accusations. But I think that's partly to do with this sort of burden of representation. I think, when there are so few representations, people become very precious about those ones that they have. I mean, I've seen people discussing it's a sin and complaining that there aren't characters who represent X, Y, and Z in it. But why should there be? That this story is about these characters who happen to share a flat. And they're a pretty diverse bunch, actually. You can't put everyone's story into one TV show or one novel. You're always going to make an editorial decision of where you're going to focus your attention. So those are really the surprising comments I've had. I've also had my former agent's partner once told me that I wrote lurid novels. And I've always kind of loved that, really. I should put that on my website, writer of lurid novels. It appeals to the kind of John Waters fan in me. But I don't consider my novels lurid.
There could be a section in the bookshop for such publications. David W. asks a very intriguing question on Twitter. There are lots of discussions around gay screen roles being played only by gay actors. How do you feel about non-gay people writing, quote, gay novels, e.g. Annie Proulx, Brokeback Mountain, or Andre Asselin, Call Me By Your Name?
I think that all novelists have the right to write about any characters that they choose. I'm not of the opinion that only gay people should write gay novels and only lesbians should write lesbian novels, etc. What I would say is that it's important that if you're not from that, if you haven't lived that experience yourself, it's very important that you inform yourself about it before you choose to write about it, because if you don't, then it just looks like tourism, and there is quite a big market. If you on Amazon, back to Amazon, there's quite a big market on Amazon of kind of gay erotic fiction written by straight women for straight women, which I was really bewildered when I discovered this, that our sex lives are being fetishized by a readership which is quite distinct from the readership you'd expect for gay novels. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think it's absolutely fine. I just think that if you're going to write those novels, then you need to acquaint yourself with the kind of people that you're writing about. I think the examples given both clearly have done that, or clearly have grown up around gay people and understand the dynamics. There's a danger of also being too reductive and saying, oh, this is a novel about this gay person, and that's an experience that only a gay person would know. I think the novels that kind of translate and reach a wider audience are ones that take in, that this struggle is part of the human condition and other people can relate to it, even if they haven't experienced it directly themselves in that explicit way. They've had something similar. They've been rejected for another reason, or they felt ostracized for some reason, or they've been hurt for some reason. And so once you appeal to those sort of universal human emotions, then obviously your work is going to have far greater reach. I think Brokeback Mountain was a wonderful story, and I really enjoyed the film. There was a huge debate at the time about the fact that, one of the characters has to end up dead. And that's been such a trope in movies about gay characters since forever. I mean, there's always this narrative whereby the gay character has to end up dead. Even before AIDS came along, that was the trope in movies. So I do understand that, but I felt that the film did the book justice. I thought it was a really beautiful film, and that the actors gave incredibly sensitive, credible performances, particularly Heath Ledger, who I thought was extraordinary in that film.
And now a question from Kate, and a question that every author likes to be asked. Are you working on a book or project now? If so, can you tell us anything about it?
I'm working on two projects at the moment, two books at the moment. One is my second novel for my current publisher. I signed a 2-book deal with Orenda, and on the basis of The Closer I Get, which is the one that came out a couple of years ago. And I'm now working on the second book of that deal. I can't say very much about it. I can't even tell you the title at the moment, but it's set in Hastings. It's about a dysfunctional family, and it's told over a period of time. So you meet them many years ago. You meet the parents when they were young people, and then you meet the offspring of those parents now. And there are some family secrets and some quite dark secrets that come to light in the course of the story. And there's a character who, one of the children of these parents, takes revenge on somebody in quite a excessive way, and that's basically where the kind of thriller element comes from. I'd written the draft of this book before COVID-19 arrived, and for the first sort of 3 to 6 months of this pandemic, I found it so difficult to write. I just couldn't get my head around adapting to what was happening in the world. I was feeling very anxious about everything, worried about my parents. I couldn't really focus on anything. And then for a long time, I've been meaning to write a memoir. I've been sort of circling it for quite a long time. A couple of years ago, a playwright called Alexis Gregory approached me because he wanted to write a verbatim play about generations of gay activism. And he had one of the people who was at the Stonewall riots in New York in 69. And he had a radical drag queen who lived through the 70s as part of the Gay Liberation Front. And he wanted to interview me as the third person about my years in ACTA. And after I took part in that project, it was a verbatim play. He interviewed the three of us and then basically performs as us on stage, telling our stories. And that kind of opened the door for me to think, well, I can actually talk about this period. I can revisit this period that I found so traumatic at the time. So I've been working on this memoir for most of the last year. And obviously a memoir, because the story is already there, you know what the story is, you know what happened, there's no surprises. In many ways, it's a lot easier to write that than it is to write fiction, which involves so many unknowns. And so I've kind of put all my attention into the memoir. I'm just approaching the end of the draft now. I've got about another 2 chapters to write, and then I'll go back to the novel and redraft that. So hopefully one or other of them will be ready in the next few months.
Well, I think the best possible advertisement for your memoir was your lecture for us this evening, which was both deeply personal and very effectively political. Thank you very much, Paul, for being with Insights this evening. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And our next lecture will be on Tuesday, but at a different time because the speaker will be in Australia. These are the type of things we're doing under lockdown. So 6:30, it's our annual defence lecture. Why Do We Fight? Evolutionary Neuroscience Meets Conflict Studies by Dr. Mike Martin. We hope very much you can join us then.